The cameras began flashing before she even reached the podium, because everyone in the hall could feel that something unusual was about to unfold. And when Giorgia Meloni stepped forward, the tension inside the room instantly changed. For months, the political atmosphere across Europe had been building toward a moment like this, even though few people realized it at the time. Behind closed doors in Brussels, a silent struggle over power, authority, and sovereignty had been unfolding between national governments and the institutions that governed the European Union. On the surface, everything looked stable. Leaders smiled during summits. Diplomats repeated the language of cooperation. Officials insisted that the European project remained strong and unified. But beneath that polished diplomatic surface, something very different was happening, and Meloni had been watching it more carefully than almost anyone else in Europe. When she first became Italy's prime minister in 2022, the political establishment in Brussels believed they understood exactly who she was. They saw her as another nationalist politician who would eventually soften once she entered government. For years, she had criticized the growing authority of European institutions and warned that national sovereignty was slowly disappearing under the weight of bureaucratic integration. Many expected that once she stepped into real power, she would either start an open confrontation with Brussels or quietly abandon her earlier rhetoric. Instead, she did something completely unexpected. She became calm. She attended meetings without confrontation. She spoke about cooperation, stability, and partnership. To many observers, it looked like she had abandoned the positions that once made her famous. Critics claimed she had been absorbed by the very system she once opposed. Supporters hoped she was simply being pragmatic. But what very few people realized was that Meloni was paying attention to something much deeper than public speeches or official agreements. The true structure of European power was not visible on television or in press conferences. It operated through meetings that happened far away from cameras and microphones, where policy directions were shaped long before they reached public debate. During her first year in office, Meloni attended dozens of these closed sessions in Brussels. They discussed migration strategy, economic coordination, energy supply, and digital regulation. At first, the process seemed predictable and bureaucratic, but gradually, patterns began appearing that raised uncomfortable questions. Proposals sometimes arrived with little room for modification, as if the outcomes had already been determined before national leaders entered the room. Certain funding decisions appeared linked to political alignment rather than purely economic criteria. Discussions about legal authority often ended with references to enforcement mechanisms that could pressure governments into compliance. None of this was necessarily illegal, but the pattern suggested that the balance between national sovereignty and supranational authority was evolving faster than many citizens realized. At the same time, tensions were spreading across the continent. Hungary had already spent years in disputes with Brussels over legal reforms and constitutional authority. Poland faced similar conflicts about the relationship between national law and European law. Smaller countries privately complained that certain financial tools were being used to influence political decisions. Each dispute had its own explanation, but when viewed together, they revealed a deeper tension inside the European project. Meloni observed all of this quietly because she understood that Europe was entering a period of transformation. Economic conditions were changing rapidly, energy prices were rising across the continent, and inflation was placing pressure on households and governments alike. Citizens were beginning to question whether the promises of economic stability that once justified deeper European integration still held true. In many countries, voters felt increasingly distant from the institutions that made decisions affecting their lives. Political movements skeptical of centralized authority were gaining momentum across multiple nations. The European Union had faced crises before, including financial instability, migration waves, and the pandemic, but this moment felt different, because the debate was no longer just about policy, it was about power. Who ultimately decided the direction of Europe? national voters or supranational institutions? The turning point arrived when a controversial legal decision involving a prominent political figure ignited arguments about the relationship between judicial systems and political power. Supporters described the decision as the result of independent legal processes. Critics argued that the timing and consequences reflected deeper political tensions inside the European system. The controversy quickly spread across television networks, newspapers, and online platforms, transforming what might have been a national legal story into a continental political debate. For Meloni, this moment confirmed something she had suspected for a long time. The political consensus that once protected European institutions from serious public scrutiny was weakening. Citizens across the continent were beginning to ask questions about transparency, accountability, and democratic legitimacy. When she stepped forward in Rome to address the nation, she understood that the words she chose would echo across Europe. Instead of delivering a dramatic attack against the European Union, she chose a different strategy. She asked questions. She asked who ultimately held the authority to define Europe's future. She asked whether decisions affecting hundreds of millions of people should remain hidden inside complex bureaucratic procedures that ordinary citizens struggled to understand. She asked how trust could survive if voters believed that political disagreement might be punished through financial or regulatory pressure. Her tone was calm and deliberate, but the impact was immediate. Across Europe, commentators began debating whether the speech represented a challenge to the European project or an attempt to reform it. Supporters described it as a defense of democratic accountability, while critics warned that questioning institutional authority could weaken the unity that had protected Europe during previous crises. Financial markets reacted cautiously, with small fluctuations in currency values as investors attempted to interpret the political signals emerging from Rome. Inside Brussels, officials moved quickly to defend the legitimacy of European institutions. Press conferences emphasized the achievements of collective action, including coordinated economic recovery plans, joint energy purchasing, and shared infrastructure development. They argued that European integration had strengthened Europe's ability to respond to global challenges and warned that fragmentation could weaken Europe's influence in an increasingly competitive world. But the debate had already expanded beyond institutional statements. Universities organized discussions about sovereignty and integration. Legal scholars analyzed treaty frameworks to determine whether the current balance of authority matched the intentions of the Union's founding agreements. Citizens who rarely followed institutional politics began reading about European governance structures and questioning how decisions were made. What had once been a technical discussion limited to policy experts was becoming a public conversation across the continent. As the months passed, Meloni proposed a broader dialogue about institutional reform. Her proposal focused on three principles: transparency, accountability, and respect for democratic mandates within member states. She argued that cooperation between nations is essential, but insisted that such cooperation must remain voluntary and respectful of national sovereignty. Some governments cautiously supported the idea. Others feared that reopening debates about authority could destabilize the delicate equilibrium that had held the European Union together for decades. Regardless of political alignment, one reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The unquestioned aura surrounding European institutions had faded. Citizens across Europe were now openly debating the future direction of integration and asking fundamental questions about how power should be distributed between national capitals and supranational organizations. Europe had entered a new political era, defined not by silent acceptance, but by open discussion about sovereignty, cooperation, and democratic accountability. The continent stood at a crossroads, and the decisions made in the coming years would shape its political identity for generations.